All right, so today we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of folks are going to find pretty interesting. We're going to be looking at what happens when you have an incoming president who wants to shake things up a bit, specifically when it comes to federal workers and the deals that might have been made with their unions by the outgoing administration.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating situation because it gets at the heart of presidential power and how much control a new president really has.
Right, and to help us unpack all of this, we've got two really interesting sources in front of us. The first one lays out all the different arguments both for and against this executive order we're going to be talking about. And then the second one is the actual text of the executive order itself, which is actually a memo that went out to the heads of all the federal agencies.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really jumps out from that memo is this real-world example they use from the Department of Education. It talks about how right before the current president took office, the previous administration negotiated a collective bargaining agreement, or a CBA for short. And this agreement basically made it super difficult to bring remote employees back to the office.
Okay, so I think this is a good time to take a step back and make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly do we mean when we talk about a lame duck period? And why do these CBAs suddenly become such a big deal during this time?
Well, it's kind of like imagine a basketball coach in the final weeks of their contract. They know they're not coming back next season.
So they might not be making the best long-term decisions for the team.
Exactly. They might be more focused on their own immediate needs rather than what's best for the team in the long run.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So in this case, the lame duck is the outgoing president. They've either lost re-election or they've reached their term limit, but they're still in office for a little while longer, even though everyone knows they're on their way out.
Right. And that's when some people start to worry about these CBAs, because the thinking is that the outgoing administration might try to use these last-minute agreements to kind of tie the hands of the incoming president, lock in policies that might clash with the new president's agenda.
Ah, so it's like a last-minute power play to try and influence things even after they're out of office.
You got it. And that's the main idea behind this executive order we're looking at today. It's basically an attempt to limit the ability of outgoing administrations to do that kind of thing, to prevent them from using CBAs to cement policies that the new president might not agree with.
Okay, so this executive order is all about who gets to set the direction for the federal workforce.
Precisely. It's a battle over authority and who has the final say.
Well, all right then. Let's dive into the arguments that our source document lays out. And it starts off by giving us a bunch of reasons why someone might think this executive order is actually a good idea.
And the first one they highlight is this idea of preserving presidential authority.
Okay, so what exactly does that mean in this context?
Basically, it means that the incoming president should have the freedom to put their own policies into action without being bogged down by agreements that were made by their predecessor.
It makes sense on the surface, but wouldn't that also depend on what those pre-existing agreements actually say? I mean, couldn't a president theoretically come in and just want to undo anything the previous administration did, even if those policies were actually working well?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really important point. And it's something that critics of this executive order bring up a lot. They argue that it could give presidents way too much power, and that it could lead to a situation where federal employees are constantly worried about their jobs and their benefits.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very stable work environment. So it seems like there's a real tension here between wanting to give the new president a fresh start, but also making sure that federal employees aren't unfairly disadvantaged in the process.
Right. It's a delicate balance for sure.
Okay, so what's the next argument in favor of the order?
The document calls it promoting democratic accountability. And the gist of it is that the policies that are in place should reflect what the people want, as expressed through elections.
Okay, so if a new president is elected on a platform of, say, reforming the civil service, then they should have the power to actually implement those reforms without being blocked by old agreements that might contradict their vision.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the will of the people is actually carried out.
But again, couldn't that also create a lot of instability for federal workers if they feel like their contracts and their working conditions are constantly at the mercy of whoever's in the White House?
You're absolutely right, and that's actually one of the main arguments against the executive order, which we'll get to in a bit.
Okay, good to know. So for now, we're still focused on the pros. What's the next point they bring up?
Well, the next one is about preventing last-minute maneuvering.
Ooh. This sounds juicy. What kind of maneuvering are we talking about here?
Well, the argument is that outgoing administrations might try to push through agreements that benefit themselves or their allies, even if those agreements aren't actually good for the government as a whole or for taxpayers in the long run.
So it's like trying to score points right before the buzzer, even if it means bending the rules a little bit.
Yeah, kind of like that.
And I'm guessing they bring up that Department of Education example here.
They argue that this CBA, which was negotiated just days before the new president took office, was a classic example of this kind of last-minute maneuvering.
Because it made it really hard to bring remote workers back to the office.
Exactly. Which could have been seen as an attempt to undermine the new administration's goals.
Okay, so the argument here is that this executive order would prevent those kinds of 11th-hour surprises.
Right. It would limit when CBAs can be finalized during a transition period.
So that a new administration wouldn't be stuck with an agreement that was basically sprung on them at the last second.
Precisely.
All right, so what else do they say in favor of this order?
Well, the next point they raise is about encouraging what they call stability and transparency.
Break that down for me.
Sure. So they're basically saying that by having clear rules about when CBAs can be modified, you create more predictability and consistency in the whole system of federal labor relations.
So less room for surprises and political gamesmanship.
Exactly. It takes away some of that uncertainty and potential for mischief.
That's good. And what's the final argument they make in favor of this executive order?
The last one is all about supporting fiscal responsibility.
Oh, okay. How does that tie into all of this?
Well, the idea is that by preventing the extension of inefficient or outdated policies through these last-minute agreements, you could potentially save the government a lot of money.
I see. So it's about preventing the outgoing administration from locking in potentially costly policies that the new administration might not agree with or be able to afford.
Exactly.
So to recap, they're saying that this executive order would preserve presidential authority, promote democratic accountability, prevent last-minute maneuvering, encourage stability and transparency, and support fiscal responsibility. It sounds like a pretty compelling case, right?
Well, it does on the surface, but remember, there's another side to this story.
Okay, hit me with it. Let's hear those counter-arguments.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so we've heard all the reasons why someone might be in favor of this executive order, but now let's switch gears and look at the arguments against it. And the document does a pretty good job of laying out the potential downsides. So the first one they talk about is this idea of weakening labor protections.
Okay, that sounds pretty serious. What are they worried about specifically?
Well, the main concern is that if a new administration can just come in and change or overturn existing CBAs, then federal employees could lose a lot of the job security and the benefits that they've fought for, the things they've negotiated over time.
So it's not just about hypothetical future agreements. It's about potentially unraveling the ones that are already in place.
Exactly. And that raises a whole bunch of questions about fairness. Is the government really upholding its end of the bargain if they can just change the rules whenever they want?
Yeah, I can see how that would create a lot of anxiety for federal workers.
Imagine you're a federal employee, you've got this contract that guarantees you certain working conditions or benefits, and then a new administration comes in and says, nope, sorry, that's all at the window now.
That would be pretty unsettling, to say the least.
It would, and that's why unions and worker rights advocates are so concerned about this executive order.
It definitely seems like it could create a lot of instability within the federal workforce.
Yeah. And that actually leads us to the next con that the document talks about, which is disrupting workplace stability.
Okay, so how would this executive order disrupt things?
Well, let's say a new administration comes in, and they have a totally different philosophy on remote work than the previous administration.
Okay.
Suddenly, all those federal employees who had negotiated the ability to work from home, they might be forced to come back to the office.
That would be a huge adjustment for a lot of people.
It would. It could disrupt their lives, their childcare arrangements, their whole routine.
And I imagine it could also affect their productivity.
Oh, absolutely. And the document actually points out that this kind of disruption could have a ripple effect throughout the entire federal government.
Not just individual workers feeling uncertain, but the whole system becoming less stable.
Right. And that instability could lead to people leaving their jobs. If federal employees feel like their work environment is unpredictable, they might start looking for other opportunities.
Yeah, and if the government loses experienced workers, that could have a real impact on the quality of public services.
Exactly. It's not just about the workers themselves. It's about the ability of the government to function effectively.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact on labor protections and workplace stability. What else does the document highlight as a concern?
Well, the next one is a bit more philosophical. It's about the potential for politicization of labor relations.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. Tell me more about that.
So the worry here is that instead of focusing on what's best for the federal workforce in the long term, these agreements could become much more vulnerable to the political whims of whoever happens to be in power at the time.
So instead of creating stable working conditions and making sure that the government can provide quality services, these decisions would become more about scoring political points or pushing a particular agenda.
That's the fear. And critics argue that this kind of politicization could really damage the civil service, make it less effective and less trustworthy.
Yeah, it's like turning these agreements into political footballs.
Exactly. Instead of treating them as the foundation for a stable and effective workforce.
Okay, so we've got weakening labor protections, disrupting workplace stability, and politicizing labor relations. Are there any other potential downsides that the document mentions?
Yeah, actually, there are a couple more. One of them is the likelihood of legal and administrative challenges.
Okay, I can see how that would happen. If unions feel like this executive order is violating their rights, they're probably going to fight back for it.
Oh, absolutely. They've already signaled that they're prepared to challenge this in court.
So even if the intention was to simplify things and give the incoming president more authority, it could actually end up creating a whole bunch of new problems.
Exactly. A lot of legal headaches and bureaucratic roadblocks.
And those legal challenges could drag on for years.
They could, and that would mean a lot of time and resources spent on fighting in court, instead of focusing on the work of government.
Not to mention the impact on morale.
Right. All this uncertainty, the potential for changes the legal battles. It's not exactly a recipe for a happy and productive workforce.
And that brings us to the final con that the document highlights, the potential reduction in employee morale.
If you're a federal worker and you constantly feel like your contract, your working conditions, your benefits, if all of that is up in the air all the time, it's bound to affect how you feel about your job.
And if people aren't happy with their jobs, they're not going to do their best work.
Exactly. And low morale often leads to higher turnover, which means the government has to spend more time and money recruiting and training new employees.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is, and it ultimately hurts the government's ability to serve the public effectively.
So it's fascinating how this one executive order touches on so many different aspects of government and public service, from presidential power to workers' rights to the day-to-day operations of federal agencies.
It really does. It's a microcosm of a lot of the bigger debates that are happening right now.
So we've really gone deep on this executive order, but I think it's important to zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger picture here.
I agree. It's easy to get caught up in the specifics of this particular order, but there's a broader question here about how we can deal with these concerns about lame duck CBAs without resorting to such a blunt instrument.
Right. Could there be other ways to address this issue? Ways that strike a better balance between respecting the incoming president's authority and protecting the rights of federal employees?
I think so. Maybe instead of this top-down approach, we could try something more collaborative.
Collaborative, like what do you have in mind?
Well, what if the incoming and outgoing administrations actually work together to ensure a smooth transition when it comes to labor relations?
Okay, so more communication, more cooperation.
Exactly.
Wow.
Imagine if the incoming administration was briefed on all the existing CBAs, and they actually had a chance to weigh in during the negotiation process, even before they officially take office.
So a more transparent and inclusive process?
Exactly. Give both sides a seat at the table.
That makes sense. And it seems like it would help prevent those last-minute surprises.
It would, and it could also reduce the chances of those kind of politically motivated agreements.
Because everyone's involved from the start.
Right. It's not about one side trying to outmaneuver the other.
It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly.
Are there any other ideas out there?
Yeah, there's another one that comes up a lot, which is giving Congress a bigger role in overseeing these CBAs.
During those transition periods.
Right. So instead of just leaving it up to the executive branch,
Congress could set some clearer guidelines for how these negotiations should happen.
they could maybe set limits on what kinds of provisions can be included in a CDA, or they could require a longer review period for any agreements that are finalized close to the inauguration.
So it's like adding another layer of checks and balances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Making sure that things are done in a fair and transparent way.
And that no one's trying to pull a fast one.
Right. It's about protecting the interests of both the government and its workforce.
It's really interesting to think about all these different possibilities and to realize that there might be better ways to do things than what we're doing now.
I think that's one of the most important things to take away from this conversation. It's not enough to just point out the problems. We need to be thinking about solutions. And we need to be willing to have open and honest conversations about how we can improve the system.
And those conversations need to include everyone who's affected by these decisions.
Exactly. Not just the policymakers, but also the federal employees, the unions.
Everyone deserves to have their voices heard.
Absolutely.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
And I think it's highlighted something really important about how we approach these kinds of topics.
What's that?
It's so easy to get stuck in this mindset of for or against, right or wrong.
Yeah, that binary thinking can be really limiting.
It is.
Yeah.
Because in reality, most issues, especially when it comes to government and policy, they're messy. They're complicated. There's nuance.
It's not always clear-cut.
Right? So we need to be willing to embrace that complexity.
To consider different perspectives.
Yeah.
To be open to the possibility that there might be more than one right answer.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. We're not just presenting information, we're encouraging our listeners to think critically, to question their assumptions and to form their own informed opinions.
It's about empowering people to engage in those difficult conversations, the conversations that are really going to shape our future.
So as we wrap things up here, we want to leave you with one final thought.
The debate over these issues, the debate over executive power workers' rights, the role of government, it's not going away anytime soon.
And it's up to all of us to stay engaged, to keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing for the kind of government we want to see.
A government that's effective and just. A government that's accountable to the people and that truly values its workforce.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.